This is a great panel. This is a great conversation that is actually very important for someone that's been involved in the internet the internet's been around for 18 years now. It started in 1995 as a commercial venture anyway. There's a lot of growth, there's a lot of discussion about it, and a lot of positives obviously around it, but there's a lot of opportunities for fraud in the electronic world, as we well know. And we've got a great panel assembled today to talk about that. And without further ado, I want to introduce the moderator for the panel from Bobbitt Business Media, Mr. Mike Antich.
Good afternoon, everybody. So as Charlie was saying, our panel discussion this afternoon is going to be dealing with the latest schemes in online fraud, title washing, odometer clocking, and VIN cloning. And we've assembled a panel of 3 industry experts to discuss each of these individual topics. To my right is Dave Sutton, Vice President at CarMax, and Dave will be discussing odometer clocking and VIN cloning. Wrong title?
Well, I'm a director at CARFAX, but I'll go with a VP role.
Excuse me, late in the afternoon. So director at CARFAX. And next to Dave is Melanie Kovach with Vice President at Auto Trader. And Melanie will be discussing online fraud. And next to Melanie is John Sidman, Director of Business Development at Experian, and John will be discussing title washing. So with that, we have a limited time, a large subject matter to cover, and I'd like to introduce our first presenter, which will be Dave Sutton.
Alrighty, I just have 4 slides and 2 stories, so this is going to be relatively painless, I hope. When we talk about odometer fraud, there is a belief that it doesn't happen as much as it really does. In a study that we did a few years ago, we found that approximately 2% of the vehicles in play out there have had some form of odometer tampering. And now that we've moved from the mechanical to the electronic, anybody who can go to YouTube could probably figure out a way to find somebody who would help them adjust the vintage of their car for a small fee. They would give them the tools to do that. And even within our own company, we've had OEMs come in who have pretty much said, no, that doesn't happen. Our cars, you cannot penetrate that system. And we were able to prove conclusively that you clearly can penetrate the system. So how do you as remarketers, how do you as auctions identify these cars and work with this? Because it's a threat out there, and it's happening more and more. In our study, we found from the first year of the study to the 3rd year of the study an increase of over 50%. And it was happening all across the country. There's not any pockets where it happens. The people are interested in doing it. They do it for a lot of reasons. Mostly it's to impact the value of the car by reducing that amount. So if we look at this is a CARFAX vehicle history report. I've got to keep in sync in front of me as I'm working with you guys up there. So what we see is on the typical car, if you can decrease the miles in a car by 10,000 miles, you might preserve or increase the value by about 500. So the average rollback is about 40,000 miles. So with that, it's worth $2,000 to somebody to roll it back, which in the old days of auction, and I'm sure nobody in here was involved in it, rolling back odometers was not that odd. It was just part of the used car, the auction business, if you hear some of the old timers tell their stories. But in today's world, there's a lot more transparency. And a lot of that transparency is very apparent in our vehicle history reports. At CARFAX, we get a whole lot of information. We get a lot of data points when the cars are being registered, what states are going to be operated in, and beyond that, when they're serviced, with the odometer reading when they're serviced. So with that, we saw in this example here that you had a vehicle that in September 2005 was being operated in Irving, Texas, had approximately 104,000 miles on it. But then later, just a few months later in December 2005, there was an ownership transfer, which is kind of a red flag, because next time we saw an odometer reading on this car, it had been rolled back to just over 21,000, almost 22,000 miles. So a very, very clear fraudulent thing. So they can do whatever they want with the electronics on the system, with their computers, internet connections, whatever, but if you have service records and other things that show the information that we collect, then it's a lot harder to hide these things. So, which cars are being impacted here? A large amount of odometer rollbacks occur with lease cars. Can anybody guess why? Because it's either going to be 20 cents, 25 cents, 30 cents, 40 cents for excess miles. And oftentimes when people go in to acquire a car, sometimes they walk out, they don't even know they leased it. They thought they were buying it. And they all think that they can, oh, I'll just drive 10,000 miles a year. And they don't. They get transferred. They drive a little bit farther. And as it gets closer, it becomes a concern. And then they're going to be talking about it. They're going to be worried about it. And somebody's going to say, hey, I got a guy. And then things go downhill from there. A very quick story. A few weeks ago, I stopped in and I was having an oil change done at an aftermarket place, a fairly big chain, not a huge chain, probably a tier 2 chain. And when the guy was looking in, I could actually sit in my car there while he did it. He looked in, looked at my odometer, and kind of wrote the number approximately correct. And I said, whoa, 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 whoa. No, it's this, 415. You transpose that. He like looked at me like I was from a foreign planet. So he says, and then he looked at me and said, oh, don't worry. I don't report that information. And I'm like, what? He goes, yeah, we're supposed to in our company, but I turned it off. Don't worry about it. It doesn't really matter. And I reached into my dashboard, a little compartment, grabbed one of my business cards and said, we need to talk. So basically, he was explaining to me, says, well, I have a lot of customers who are lease customers, and they don't like, recording the odometer. It makes them uncomfortable. And I said, so let me get this straight. So if you decided as a businessman or the manager of this shop that you're going to side with the people who defraud automotive finance companies, some of you are in the room, OEMs who have warranty concerns with that, and the next potential owner of their car, so you're going to cater your business to that group. It says, tell you what, here's my card. When you turn it back on, when you decide to participate in the righteous part of the car market, the right part of the car business, please let me know and I'll come back. Because right now you're catering to the wrong guys and it makes you nothing more than a criminal. And his jaw dropped and I pulled away. So that was kind of an interesting story, but it happens, and if you do record the odometer readings along the way, it can prevent a whole lot of problems for you and for others. So the next thing I wanted to touch on real quickly is VIN cloning. So VIN cloning happens when somebody has a vehicle that for whatever reason has a very bad title, has a very bad history, etc. So to get a VIN label, acquire one and get it onto that car. Here's a very simple example, and it's a little bit choppy, but if you look at it, it's torn around the edges, it's not pristine. The numbers on the actual VIN itself, some are in italics, some are in regular font. This happens a lot with high-end vehicles, and oftentimes these cars are offered in various venues. Hopefully they don't come through your auctions. Hopefully they don't happen to the cars that you're remarketing, but I'll bet some of you in your current standing inventory have cars where there's been VIN cloning. So when you think about VIN cloning, as it happens, law enforcement officers work with us. We have at any point in time 15 to 20 different cases that we're supporting with data because we're helping to combat this. And when it happens, it's not just one car, it's a group of cars. Organized crime is involved in this. When a vehicle has a dual identity, it's pretty easy to track, and I'll show you an example in just a minute. But the vehicles, when this happens, essentially somebody could buy a car which is actually a stolen car. And then they have no recourse. If it's a stolen car, they own nothing, and they could lose $25,000 to $30,000. The primary targets in this area are more towards the high-end vehicles, and oftentimes, once these cars are transacted, eventually they'll be shipped to other parts of the country, or shipped overseas. The cool part about when it's shipped to other parts of the country is companies like CARFAX, we could identify in this clear example that you had a vehicle that was being owned and operated in Virginia. All of a sudden, a VIN, the same VIN number, is showing that it's being serviced and operated in Utah, but then later we get records with the odometer readings consistent with the first Virginia, back in Virginia where it's being operated. So it's very clear in this example that a VIN was cloned on a vehicle that was shipped or sold or added that improper VIN to a vehicle in Utah, and they were operating this way. So, but you can't see it with one piece of information, you see it with several pieces of information. So unfortunately, consumers are oftentimes left holding the bag. And a lot of these cars are handled on an online sales channel, oftentimes a direct-to-consumer sales channel, hopefully not in the sales channels that you're using. But to talk a little bit more about online selling and how this comes into play, I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Melanie Kovach from Autotrader.com.
Thanks, Dave. You know, they say crime doesn't pay, but I think G. Gordon Liddy said if crime didn't pay, there would be no crime. So as Mike and Dave said, my name is Melanie Kovach. I oversee consumer and specialty sales for Autotrader.com. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the crime of online fraud, how that impacts our consumer experience and our customers, and maybe more importantly, what we're doing to help protect our consumers and our customers. And so I think the most important and pertinent question is really, how big is this problem, right? And so I'll tell you what, this problem is bigger than a bread box. So consumers report that they are losing about $500 million a year. And so based on 2011 numbers, the average loss was $4,000, but the median loss was $600. So what that means is the distribution curve is not a nice little bell curve. It means it's a really wacky curve where there's folks who are losing very little money, and then many folks who are losing a significant amount of money, in many cases $100,000 or more per case. And so what the $500 million losses look like are a bunch of different scams. But the top 5 scams are these. And these are listed in order of losses. And so the first one is FBI-related scams. And what that essentially is fraudsters pretending that they're the FBI to defraud consumers. The second is identity theft. I think we're all familiar with identity theft, right? Taking over someone's identity to commit a crime. And then there's advanced fee fraud. And essentially what that is where fraudsters convince victims to give them a small amount of money so they can get something really valuable. So they might say, you just want a car, but first you got to pay the taxes. So pay those taxes and then I'll deliver that car for you. And the fourth is non-delivery of merchandise. And that's really folks not getting the goods that they paid for. And then there's the overpayment fraud. And the way this works is that the fraudster will pretend that they sent a sum of money, either through a cashier's check or a money order, something that's really not real, but they will accidentally overpay. And they will ask the victim to send them the difference between what they were supposed to pay and what they really paid, when they obviously really didn't pay anything at all. And so the type of fraud that we most commonly deal with is what the FBI calls auction fraud. And so auction fraud, I'm sure you will not be surprised, is really folks, fraudsters, luring consumers to give them money for a car that either just doesn't exist or that the fraudsters themselves do not own. Now, this is not a new scam, but this has gotten more sophisticated. The fraudsters now are doing a better job of enabling this scam. And the bad part of the scam, it opens the door for other scams. And so auction fraud really accounts for only about $8 million of the losses annually, but again, it opens the door to more losses, is what ends up happening. And so typically what the fraudsters are doing are using fake credit cards to list ads for cars that don't exist, or they're trying to hijack ads. And so before I talk about the details of how they go about hijacking ads, I wanted to reiterate what Dave said. You know, he mentioned that when we're talking about fraudsters, we're talking about organized crime. We're not talking about, mischievous teenagers in their parents' bedrooms causing trouble. We're talking about, Tony Soprano type organized crime. And a lot of times these folks are in Eastern Europe. And so you might wonder why organized crime is focused on online fraud. Well, they find that it's a little less dangerous and more profitable than, say, drug trade. So late last year, as a matter of fact, there was a crime ring that was operating out of Romania, the Czech Republic, the UK, and Canada that the FBI successfully arrested and took out of the game, which was a big win. Didn't solve the problem, but made a dent. And so, again, there are just really bad people doing bad things, and they're trying to get listings and advertise them to dupe consumers. And so here's an example of a phishing scam, right? So what happens is the fraudster emails our customers and pretends they're us. So they send this email that says that we need them to log into their account and verify that it exists because we think it might be fraud. Please click here. So the person getting this email sees the AutoTrader logo and they see the colors and they say, oh, AutoTrader's asking me to do something, and they click here. What happens next is they go to a web page that looks like AutoTrader and they enter in their account information, which now the fraudster can use that information to hijack their ad. What is worse that could happen here is they click on that link and it installs malware on their computer, which gives the fraudster the ability to completely take over their computer. Anybody see Girl with a Dragon Tattoo? Anybody? Thank you. So if you didn't see that movie, the main character essentially uses this type of tool to monitor what her enemies and some of her friends are doing at any given time on their computer. It's like she has access to sitting in front of their computer even though she's not. It's like she's in their living room. And so that can happen just by clicking that one simple link. Another example here is where the fraudster pretends that they're a buyer. And so they email the seller and they say, you know what, in this specific example, I'm an oceanographer, I'm out to sea, so I can't see your car and I can't talk to you, but my dad's birthday's coming up and he really wants a Mercedes just like yours. So I'm willing to give you the money, just give me your PayPal account and I'll get that money deposited. And so here, there's really three things that could happen. One, they're trying to steal their identity of the seller. Two, they're trying to hijack their PayPal account. And then three, it's really setting up for that overpayment scam, where they'll say, they'll produce proof that they have put that money into their PayPal account, and they'll tell the seller, oh, I accidentally put an extra $2,000 in there. Can you, just send me back $1,800, for your trouble, keep $200. And so, obviously, you don't want to click on those links. Now, going back to this whole link clicking thing, what's happening more often now, and like a newer looking scam, when you click on any of those links, you essentially are giving your cookie information to that fraudster. So what that means is your session and that cookie is all recorded, and then you're handing it over. So let's say you went to your email account and you typed in your username and password on Yahoo, and then you ended up clicking on that link. Now that cookie went to the fraudster, and they have your username and password for your email. So now they go into your email account and they log in, and what they tend to do is go into your spam folder, and they create a new folder in there. And so now they can send emails to people as you and respond and go back and forth, and you'll never know it because it's all happening in your spam folder. Or they'll set up an auto forward where your emails will start all getting forwarded to their email address as well. And so now, while they're in your email account, they can see you have an Amazon account, they can see who you bank with, and they'll write to those folks and ask them, can you send me my password? I lost it. And when they write back to you, they'll also get that email. And now they have access to your Amazon account, your bank account, and in our case, your AutoTrader ad. And so what they'll do is go to the AutoTrader ad, change the contact information maybe, or they'll just change their the price perhaps to lure people in. And so they'll be like living in your email account, doing all this as you, and duping someone into buying your car and wiring them money. And obviously then that person's never going to actually get your car. So I talked about the phishing going to these clone sites, and just 2 weeks ago we found this one. Essentially, it's a whole version of AutoTrader Classics. You go to that site, everything's the same. It has all our articles, all the inventory, all the functionality. It looks pretty good, except that it's missing an R and an E in the URL, and it's not really AutoTrader Classics. And so they sent this phishing email, send people to this page, get them to put their information so they can take over their ad. Typically the MO is lower the price to a too good to be true deal, and people fall for that because they want a deal. And so classic cars are especially vulnerable because they're high priced, and folks tend to buy them sight unseen. That happens in this category. So it's a hot area for fraudsters. Now, I've told you all the bad things fraudsters are doing to our shoppers and sellers, which may make you think, man, I am never shopping or selling with Autotrader.com again. But have no fear. We invest heavily in protecting our consumers and our customers. And so we really are investing in 4 different areas. One is education. So we spend a lot of money, time, and energy in educating our employees and educating our customers. And then secondly, we have a best-in-class automated system called a Certify that we use to automatically filter out fraudulent ads where we find them, so that they won't make it to the site, or they'll get pulled down if they are in fact fraud. But then there's ads that are kind of on the cusp, and the system says these might be fraud. We have a team of fraud analysts who review those ads and contact our sellers and work with our dealers to make sure that those in fact are their cars and that they are legitimate. And then lastly, we have a whole team of security technology folks who really, that's all they do, is focus on scanning the internet landscape to find these phishing scams and these cloning sites to just bring them down. And so you might be thinking, well, what are you supposed to do? And you know, it's really about awareness, and at the end of the day, it's when there's a deal that seems too good to be true, well, it is. And I thought as a public service announcement, I would put up these top 25 passwords that the FBI releases. These aren't 25 passwords for AutoTrader, they're for everything across the internet. If you're using any one of these, you should change your password this moment. By using that password, you are essentially giving your password to fraudsters. So, as you're making a note to change your password, I think we're going to take questions at the end of our session. So if you have any questions for me then, I'll be happy to answer those. Until then, I'm going to pass the baton on to John. Thanks, John. I'm glad people do it.
Thank you. I'm John.
You did great. Oh.
Are we good? All right, sorry, thank you. John Sidman, I'm Director of Business Development with Experian Automotive. I'm here to talk a little bit about title washing. Title washing's been around for quite a while, but I thought I would go ahead and provide some information on a little bit around, waiting for it to switch. Sorry. Technical.
John, both of these things are my fault because I insisted on the lavalier.
That's okay. No, it's all right, you know. We'll get there. There we go. Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about title washing. First of all, title washing, as many of you already know, is the process in which you're taking a title that has a brand on it, whether that be salvage or rebuilt or whatever, and then taking it, or that vehicle, to another state or multiple states in order to get a clean title issued on the vehicle. The question is why does that happen and how does that happen? It happens for a lot of different reasons. First and foremost, states across the country all have different rules, regulations, and laws as it relates to branding titles. Some states don't recognize brands that come from other states when they come with a new title, and other states actually have regulations in them where they'll go ahead and issue a clear title for a rebuilt title if you pay a fee and submit to an inspection for stolen parts. So people who are doing this, the fraudsters that are doing this, or dealers that are doing this, where they're taking it from state to state in order to get a clean title, are fairly familiar with the process that happens. Recently, I was actually online looking at an online listing for a Highline vehicle, and the vehicle actually had a certificate of destruction. And in the online listing, the seller of the vehicle was being a really nice seller, in full disclosure. I was talking to Dave about earlier, was providing full disclosure and basically provided any buyer the title washing 101 on how to handle this vehicle. He basically walked down the list of where to take the vehicle in order to get it retitled so it could get a rebuilt title, and then where to take it so that they can get the rebuilt title to a clear title. So I found that quite interesting. And so although that we have all this information that's out there today available, title washing still happens and happens quite frequently. Title washing, in the presence of title washing, the natural disasters and the flooding and the things that go on in the United States recently have created a lot of awareness around it. Most recently was Hurricane Sandy, which is why a lot of this topic is coming up today. But over the last several years, we've had a significant number of disasters or states of emergencies declared. From back in 2010 and 2011, there were more incidences where there was a natural disaster declared or a state of emergency declared, even more so than in 2012 with Sandy. Now, it's not always hurricanes that cause an issue. Although hurricanes are typically the most frequent reasons why states of emergency are declared or disasters are declared, there are several disasters that occur in some of the other states around the country from just storms, whether they be winter-related storms, rainstorms, and flooding. And these typically are the reasons why a lot of cars end up getting salvage titles, but it's not the only reason. So what Experian wanted to do is we wanted to go ahead and take a look and determine what's going on in the industry today in terms of titles being branded. So what we did is we went ahead and looked at the first 6 months of 2011 and the first 6 months of 2012. And we said, how many vehicles were branded in those two time frames? And what was the distribution of those types of brands? So back in 2011 and 2012, there was approximately 2 million vehicles in each of those 6 month periods that had a title branded. About 80% of those title brands were either branded as a salvaged or rebuilt title. So quite prevalent in terms of those two particular areas. Next, we wanted to go look at and say, okay, what states are branding the most titles? So what we're looking at here is the 10 states that branded the most titles in those two time periods. What was really interesting about this is that 50% of all the titles that were branded during that period came from these 10 states. Now, if you notice, not most of them aren't coastal areas where you link them to a hurricane or some type of major event. There are several that are in the Midwest, which typically mean they're areas that are susceptible to types of flooding, whether that be through heavy rains or other types of events. Another factor that could lead to the brands is the rules that they have and the regulations that they have in terms of what designates a vehicle being salvaged. Several states have different threshold levels. If the threshold level is a little lower, they may brand more vehicles as salvaged or rebuilt or something like that. The next thing we wanted to do is we wanted to take a look at those brands that were issued in the early part of 2011 and the early part of 2012. What we did is we said, okay, of those that were branded, how many of them were later issued a title that was clean? And so what we found is that in 2012, of the brands that were listed in the first 6 months of 2012, 21% of them were later issued a title that was clear. And in 2011, it was 13%. And those are pretty consistent with some of the statistics we've done from previous surveys or studies that we did from back in 2007 and 2008, where they're about 15 and 16%. So it's a pretty common problem and continues to be a common problem. The other thing that was interesting is that there was no state that had zero occurrence. So every state had at least a few occurrences in which a title was washed, or the title was branded and then got a clear title. The other thing that we noticed was, if you look carefully, insurance loss is 15% of all the vehicle brands that were washed, but only 6% of the vehicles that were branded. So there's a great sensitivity in that market for vehicles that are listed as insurance loss. Those seem to have a much higher propensity to be washed in the process. The major thought about this and what's come to our attention is because of Hurricane Sandy. Now, I know everybody wants to get statistics on, okay, how has Hurricane Sandy been impacting this? The vehicles are going to be coming back into market. What's going on? Well, the problem is it's still a developing story. NICB shows that there's over 250,000 vehicles that were damaged in Hurricane Sandy. The problem is those are only vehicles that an insurance claim was filed against. There are many, many more vehicles that were damaged and didn't necessarily have an insurance claim filed against it. The two biggest states impacted from an NICB standpoint were New York and New Jersey. Experian did a brief study to identify the increase in the brands in those areas. And what we saw when we looked at the states that were affected is that we looked at November 2012 to January 2013, and we compared that to the same period in 2011. and some states has as much as a 45% increase in the number of brands that they've been issuing than they did the previous year. So this process is still happening right now. That's a picture of a lot, or basically a lot. It's an airstrip in New York that had 15,000 vehicles sitting on it waiting to be sold as recently as January. Those vehicles are either tagged as salvage or getting branded as salvage, and they're going to be going through the sales, and they'll sell. And it may be a few months before we see those vehicles come back into the industry and back into our auctions. And it'll be very interesting to run the same analysis we did in a couple months to see how many of those vehicles actually came back with a clear title. So really, what does this mean for you guys? How do you protect yourself against this kind of stuff? The first and foremost is be aware. Know that it exists. Know that it happens. You know, we get comfortable saying, well, we have all this information and it's available to us. It can't be happening now, but it is, and it's happening at a pretty regular and steady pace. Be educated. Know what your rules and laws and regulations are in the states that you're in terms of branding. Know what the brands mean. And of course, use available resources. Using vehicle history reports and getting inspections done are extremely important in terms of helping you identify a potential vehicle that's been title washed. Lastly, I thought I'd leave you with some tips on how to identify vehicles that have been flooded. I'm sure most of you have done this many times and have looked at it, but these are just a few of the tips that are out there. One that's not on the list, which was always my favorite when I worked back in the remarketing world in the auction space, is I was always taught that if you have a sense that a vehicle might have had water in it, you walk over to the front seatbelt and you pull the seatbelt all the way up. And when it locks, you pulled it all the way up. And if you look carefully in a flooded vehicle, there will be a water line across the seatbelt. Most when people are being fraudulent or trying to get away with washing a car or washing a title, they forget to clean the seatbelt as it rolls up into its mechanism. And so it's a quick way to determine if that, one, how high the water level was, and two, did it actually get flooded. So I know title washing is a concern, and it's going to be a concern for several months going forward because of things like Hurricane Sandy and some of the natural disasters that have happened. But here's some of the things that you can do to help protect yourself. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.
Okay, with that, I'd like to thank all three panelists, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thanks. He made that thing.